Good day, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to see you today. My name is Dustin Cormier. Today, we're watching another episode of Howtorockastrology. I'm very excited today to be talking with someone who I now consider to be my friend. We have today Timothy Halloran hanging out with us from Rasa Lila Healing.com. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today, Timothy.
Thank you so much, Dustin. It's an honor to be here. It's so much an honor to have you as a friend. And I'm very excited to be connecting with yourself and other like minds. It's a pretty specialized world. So it's good to be connecting.
Absolutely. Yes. Astrology is really a wonderful thing to be able to share and convey knowledge about. Now, for everybody who's watching and who's interested, my friend Timothy here has been studying astrology for longer than 10 years. But as you mentioned, you've really taken astrology to be your single-pointed focus, and you've been doing astrology on YouTube and professionally in general since about 2012. So it's been about 10 years since you've been really this focused on astrology. Am I correct in saying that?
That's right. This has been my life for the last 10 years consecutively. Yeah.
Wonderful. And I love to hear that, pal. Now, what I often like to do, my audience knows that I often like to give a little glimpse of the chart nature of the person that we're speaking to give a sense of the energy of who it is I'm talking to. You've mentioned, Timothy, that you have Cancer rising. You have the sun in Gemini, and that's correlated with the 12th house energy. And as well, you have the moon in Taurus, an exalted moon in Taurus in what we would call also an 11th house energy as well. Would you say that that's correct?
That's me. Yep.
Wonderful. I love it, Timothy. You're born in the year of the metal horse. That's 1990. And I find it's interesting. As I mentioned, you and I talked for a little while before we started doing this video. And I find it interesting that you have the moon exalted in Taurus, and it's in the 11th house. I find when the moon is exalted, the moon is an adaptive planet that's the self adapting to the world around it. And the moon is really good at this when it's in Taurus, because that's its exaltation point. It provides others what would attract the support that it seeks. And that's how the moon is supposed to operate. And it's interesting to me that you have the moon, which is your Cancer rising as your ascendant lord, is in the 11th house. I found it to be an interesting correlation that you are putting a lot of effort into making a community. You're making a community of like-minded people who, as I've understood it, as we've talked about it, this community is kind of really more than just astrology. You are doing the important work of bringing us all together in the field of healing through a community that includes Jungian psychologists, that includes holistic therapists in general, and all general senses of therapy is what you seem to be grounding this community on. Now, I can't say it as well as, I would love to invite you to talk about this community, which everybody can find and start exploring by looking on the website for it, which is rasalilacommunity.com. It's RASALILA community.com. I think that's a great idea, Timothy. Would you mind sharing a little bit about your intentions with this community that you've been creating?
Of course, and thank you for the opportunity to plug this community. I'm very excited and passionate. The idea here is that we want to create a platform that does provide community support for those who are on a healing journey. And astrology can certainly be an incredibly powerful tool, a map and a guide on the journey of healing. But we also recognize that there are other necessary tools, healing modalities, and certainly any one of us on our healing journey we need support. We cannot just do it ourselves. So what we're really exploring in this community is how to connect astrology with other art forms, other therapies. So that way we can understand, okay, this is my life, this is what I'm working with, and I can be connecting with these other people on similar healing journeys, and then be able to support one another on our healing journeys, as well as to really see it all reflected in astrology. And a part of the community is also my astro school, where people can come and get an education in evolutionary astrology, and then again also get the additional resources and support to turn it into a real healing practice.
Wonderful. I think that's an amazing thing, Timothy, because I'm sure there's many people who really apply astrology at an armchair length. You know, that's the old classic phrase. It's an armchair philosophy for a lot of people. Whereas you are inviting the world to engage with this consciousness, because so many people at the beginning of their astrology journey, even those whose path is not called to be a professional astrologer, you know, these are people who ought to be talking to each other in a community, allowing their personal narrative to unfold in a community, and to have a bunch of like-minded people all sharing compassionately to fill in those gaps for those who do not have the time and the lifestyle to study these ancient sciences the way we do. I think it's a wonderful idea, and I give you huge kudos for doing that.
Well, thank you. And kudos also to you, because I know we're both vested in the similar interest of connecting astrology with also genuinely caring about people. That's why we're in this business. And so, yeah, education and damage prevention is a huge part of this work, because certainly astrology is a very powerful tool. As you were mentioning when we were talking earlier, it's like a scalpel.
Right.
So this could be used by a surgeon to perform a life-changing surgery just as much as it could hack a person up.
Right.
And so we're really interested in that damage prevention to make sure that people are using astrology in a way that's going to really help benefit other people to live their actual lives.
Wonderful. That's very clarifying, Timothy. Now, before we start, I would like to mention, it seems to me you and I talked a lot about, you have been very steeped in the works of Jeffery Wolf Green and of what I would call evolutionary astrology, EA, as people often hear about it. Am I correct in correlating your general lineage very strongly with that particular tradition?
Absolutely. Yeah, this really has been my last 10 years, is to dive head over heels into evolutionary astrology, as was taught by Jeffery Wolf Green. And Jeffery Green's work does have its roots in the humanistic astrology that was largely pioneered by Dane Rudhyar.
Right. Cool. Dane Rudhyar, no kidding. Did he have bones of the same philosophy of evolutionary astrology in that sense?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I would have to credit Dane Rudhyar as the real seed founder of evolutionary astrology.
Wow.
It's really the same perspective that we take.
Very clarifying, Timothy. Thank you for giving me that tidbit, because I'm very interested in Dane Rudhyar's work. He's an incredible esoteric interpreter. So, for everybody watching, today my interest has been bring you on today, Timothy. There's so much that you and I can talk about, and I'm really excited to just go into. There's so many things that I would love to invite you here for into my channel. Today, in particular, we have decided to get together and talk about the implications of eclipses. One of the first things that I saw you talking about when I have seen your channel, I'm very interested in the consciousness that you have with the new moon and the full moon. I know you do a lot of transit readings for when the new moon is, for example, if it's in Aries, and then when the full moon happens in Libra, and the correlations of all the other planetary transits going on during these new moons and full moons. And when I heard you talking about eclipses, I knew that I had to, I knew that I wanted to make a questionnaire to help myself as well as my audience get a sense of the long range evolutionary implications of the eclipses. I think it's something that is not talked about enough. The Vedic world really does talk about it, but even in that sense, it's not something that my schooling really focused on. My tropical Vedic astrology schooling really focused on natal horoscopy. And I'm very glad to be talking with you about the eclipses, because I know that this is something you've been studying for a long time. So what we sort of fleshed out here, Timothy, is we were thinking of the first thing I want to ask you in terms of these eclipses. You know, there's a real, as I said, there's an evolutionary arc happening where I've noticed that solar eclipses will happen in a sign in 1 year. And then let's say after another year and a bit, the solar eclipse will happen in the sign previous. And then the next couple of years, another solar eclipse will happen in the next sign previous. So it's almost like there's an overarching arc of evolution in the same way that really the north node going backwards and the south node going backwards. There seems to be an evolutionary process unfolding there relating to the eclipses. So the first thing I'd like to do, I've noticed that, as you and I have discussed previously, there is a resonance of the solar eclipse with what we typically correlate to the new moon. Now, most people know about the new moon. I'm almost seeing the new moon as a microcosm of a solar eclipse. Whereas every month when we experience a new moon, there is something happening, a new beginning, a new initiation of wherever that new moon is occurring. And this, of course, we know it happens monthly in the sense of the new moons. As we're speaking right now, the most recent new moon was in the sign of Aries. And this is an initiation point of for anyone that has any points in Aries. The next month is the new moon is going to happen in Taurus. After that, the new moon will happen in Gemini. And there is an evolving narrative that happens there month to month. I'm happy today to talk with you about this overarching, similar, you know, in the way that the new moon is a microcosm, there's a macrocosmic new moon happening every time there's a solar eclipse. And when a solar eclipse happens, we can correlate it almost like a new moon. Would you say that I'm on the right track in how I've conveyed this, Timothy?
For sure. And I'd be very happy to break this down, as it's going to really, I think, be a shining example to tie together a few different layers or systems that astrologers use. And in so doing, it's going to reveal one of the amazing truths about astrology, that we're oftentimes looking at the same fundamental patterns that are reflected on many different levels. Mm-hmm. First, to introduce this topic a bit, I'll also say, you know, we were mentioning before we began talking that different astrologers specialize in different areas. Different astrologers have different birth charts themselves. Mm-hmm. And so they may have more or less dominant planets that they are more or less attuned to. And so one of the planets that I'm especially attuned to is the moon. And
makes sense.
In addition to that, most of these last 10 years, I have done regular YouTube videos on new and full moons. And so I've been especially tuning into the lunar cycles. That's been my focus, and that's been my work.
Right.
Evolutionary. Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, the moon is so important. I'm always so excited to talk about the moon as just being such a major way to see and witness and experience the astrology in a very personal, lived sense. But evolutionary astrologers, humanistic astrologers, were also moon's nodal astrologers. That in particular is what we're focused on when we're reading charts, when we're interpreting the energy. It's almost like the backbone of the energy system, or the structure of the soul, or the structure of consciousness that the birth chart reflects.
So that it's moving through. Yeah, I'd like to say at this point, I mentioned that in the cosmology of the Vedic system, we generally contend that the moon is considered to be the Jivatman. Jiva relating in a way to vitals, to the true experienced energy. The Jivatman is the lived experience of what we call the Atman, which is the sun. The sun is the eternal pure awareness in the soul, the infinite potentials that is contained in every phase of life. The sun is that Atman. But just as the moon can only reflect a glimmer of the sun's light at any one time, in the same way, while we all have the eternal nature of the Atman inside of us, we have to experience it through cyclical evolutionary cycles on Earth, in our lived Earth experience. And it makes total sense to me that we can understand the soul as whatever it is. And a lot of people are attracted to solar astrology to see what that soul is. And that is important. But it's, it's almost like there's a disconnect if you can't relate the personal narrative of your life at this moment to what is being conveyed by solar astrology. I wonder if I'm reading you correct in the sense of the importance of lunar astrology and the moon in this regard.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're in total agreement there. And it always makes me happy to hear, when tradition has preserved the importance of the moon as, archetypally, symbolically, the moon has not always been respected or important in our recent civilization and societies that we've built. So absolutely, I agree. And in evolutionary astrology, we say that the moon is the ego, but we don't see the ego as a negative thing, certainly not simply the thing that gets in the way. Rather, the ego is the vehicle that we are using to learn, grow, and evolve through having personally lived and emotionally felt experience. And what we say in EA, and EA is just nature itself. None of this comes from a man-made system. It's all discovered. It's self-evident. So what we say is that this vehicle of evolution actually reflects the trinity of the water trine, where the ego, the moon, our personally lived experience is connected to Pluto, the soul, that is living many lifetimes of experience and actually generates full spectrum experiences for our ego to live. And our ego, it's good, bad, and ugly. It's a full spectrum. But Pluto is the evolutionary force and the catalyst that actually has these deeper desires that go much further beneath the ego into the roots of the soul, and then pushes the ego through these experiences. And then we learn, grow, and evolve back into our connection and sensitivity to Pisces, Neptune, which is this overall higher soul, and tuning into the soul of God. So the moon is absolutely essential because it is actually through our personal lived experience and the emotions that we feel. And that's so important to highlight. That's a big part of why I'm passionate about the community, is to provide people support to actually live and feel through our life, because this is easier said than done. It's through the emotional feeling of our experience of life that our soul is gaining experience and learning and growing. So if we're not feeling, we actually cannot evolve. We cannot grow.
Right.
And the significance of the moon via transit is we can actually track what is our personal lived, emotionally felt experience. How is that playing out collectively at this moment in time? How is this moment in time through the moon triggering the rest of my chart and the dynamics I'm living and growing through in my life. And that's the usefulness of tracking, lunar cycles and comparing lunar cycles to our chart. Because as we'll probably look at when we take a look at some examples, new moons, and especially, it's like going to highlight via a personally lived and emotionally felt experience a part of our chart, and therefore our overall consciousness. That part's going to be lived, it's going to be experienced, and that's where we're going to learn and grow through that lived experience. Right. So looking at the moon actually connects all of the rest of the chart into our personal lived experience. And I think that's especially why it's an important thing to look at, and not something to overlook, even though it's fast moving. And it's actually the part of our consciousness that is coming into contact and feeling the rest of our life, the rest of what's going on in this moment.
What's very funny is that I've just recently had an experience with my girlfriend where she's coming into a deep spirituality in herself. And we were talking about this very interesting thing where she felt emotionally blocked for a long time, and she's recently been tapping into her emotions. And what a spontaneous thought that came to me was that is the symbol of baptism, of being placed, of the water being a part of your initiation into full spiritual reception. I think it's funny that people see, in the Christian tradition, you dip the baby's head in water, and this is a symbol of them being brought into a spiritual reception. I think personally, what I'm coming to understand is that is really the physical phenomenon is just it's like a book. It's just a tradition that is holding knowledge. That knowledge being that emotions are the first thing that is needed in order to grapple with your spiritual evolutionary processes.
Absolutely. And this is the function of the moon, is that egoic, emotionally felt experience is what is informing us of what's happening in our life.
Right.
It is our story, but it's not a story to put down or minimize as something being insignificant. That is what we came to live.
Right.
It's not like we just transcend our story, our ego, and then everything just is stuff that's happening. It's meaningful why we're feeling what we are feeling. It's informing us of our personal reality. And Wonderful. This is, again, an area that I find our civilization and society is not naturally gifted at. And I recall glancing at your chart, Dustin, a south node of the moon in Cancer, a Pluto in the 4th house. So I'm sure you're well situated and capable to help your girlfriend through this.
Well, thank you for saying that, Timothy.
Connecting with her emotional space. Sure, you're certainly a space holder. You create a very safe feeling, nourishing, welcoming, warm container. Certainly that's a huge part of what allows you to do your work. But I will also add that that's the necessary ingredient to do any healing work.
Because again, for saying that, but I agree.
For anybody to transform, you have to feel safe to feel. And then you can talk to an astrologer about your personal lived experience. If that doesn't click, it's almost a waste of time.
Absolutely. And everyone has to be faced with the father energy somewhere along the line, or, going and dealing with work, and like you've got a boss that's coming down and hitting you without having asked for your consent to hit you with some kind of knowledge. And we can see how a lot of the times a lot of well-meaning fatherly energy just doesn't click, doesn't connect with the person, because they have not been invited to safely integrate what they want and need from within themselves, from within what they know they can take. And that's an important experience for anybody going through a legitimate healing experience.
Absolutely. Must
I
be
love
a
the way you
Cancer
put
Capricorn dynamic you're talking about there.
Feels like it. Feels familiar to me, as I'm sure we're going to see.
Perhaps so. Um, to come back full circle to,
Hmm.
lunar cycles and eclipses. So, as you mentioned, every year we have the very predictable solar cycle of the sun going through the tropical zodiac. And that's what's so powerful and important about the tropical zodiac, is that it's fixed between the solstices and the equinoxes. We have these very predictable 12 zodiac signs that are just so crystal and so apparent when you study the tropical zodiac. So you usually get a new moon per each zodiac sign. This is why we have a Roman calendar with 12 months. It does reflect the Egyptian same solar astrology that we're talking about and using today. Sometimes you get the blue moon phenomenon, where you might get two new moons or full moons in the same zodiac sign, but that's pretty rare.
Right.
So there's a very amazing, very predictable pattern. And this is the zodiac itself, is the dance of life. It is the pattern of all life experience, the evolutionary unfolding of consciousness here on planet Earth. Now, the moon's nodes, this is really what I talk about all day, every day. How I interpret birth charts, what I want to teach people interested in astrology is about the moon's nodes. I hope that one day in the future we get to people, using more of the system we do in evolutionary astrology, where people won't simply ask, what's your sun, moon, rising sign? I look forward to the day where people are asking, what house is your Pluto in? What house and sign are your moon's nodes in? What house and sign are the planetary rulers of your moon's nodes?
No
Because the
kidding.
moon's nodes by house and sign in any person's birth chart is going to be the backbone of their life. It is going to provide more information about that person's life, their personality, and experience more than any other part of the chart.
Totally.
Moon's nodes.
Wonderful. That's funny. The Vedic people are with you on that. They really put a huge emphasis on what's called Rahu, the north node, and then Ketu, the south node. And it is, they've got a great story in the Vedas of this character named, who was symbolized Rahu and Ketu together. It was one person. And when all the gods were getting the bliss nectar of divine consciousness, this was one character who was considered one of the asuras, who was in the in-between of the divine nature of the pure consciousness of the planets and the what's called the asuras, which is the biological memory of humanity. And this character drank the nectar of immortality, but Vishnu saw it and cut the head of this character with a discus so that it was severed, so that the head became Rahu and the body was Ketu. And the body of Ketu and the head of Rahu are trying to come into an integration. Ketu being the past, and then Rahu being the integration point of the divine nectar of immortality.
Absolutely.
It's a story that
I love that story. I love Vedic culture, and the churning of the ocean of milk.
You got it. That's the
is
classic.
This cosmological tension where the symbolism of the moon's nodes, or Rahu Ketu, is the natural tension in every person's lived experience between the past and the future. And every single human is using that natural tension between the past and the future to learn, grow, and evolve. So the South Node is always in any person's chart going to be a hugely defining part of that person's identity. It's going to reflect what past experiences the soul wanted to have, what the soul's cultivated and is bringing into this life, which is usually gifts and talents coupled with what may be blind spots or shadow dynamics, because as much as we've done the past, we're familiar with the past, it's comfortable to us, and at the exact same time, the soul's been there, done that, and we're sick of it. The moon's north node is where we're trying to get into the future. That's the antidote to the potential challenges of the south node, or being stuck in the past. The antidote to unstuck us from the past is the north node. That's where our soul wants to go and is coming into potential. North node by house and sign, as well as the planetary ruler of the north node by house, sign, and aspect. And so
Beautiful.
the North Node is the future where we want to go.
Mhm.
And at the same time, the future is unknown.
Right.
So there's a natural hesitancy to take that step into the future of the unknown. And that's, again, this natural tension, this churning of the milk, is that we're comfortable in the past, we're sick of it. We
Mm.
want to go into the future, but it's
But we're
unknown.
afraid of it.
So we're using that tension. Every single person in their chart, the moon's nodes by house and sign, that
You
polarity
really, yeah, you
is
put
going
that
to,
great.
that's our life experience. That's what we're living, why we're living it. And that's what we want to get to in evolutionary astrology, is not just what it is that we're experiencing, but why, for the purpose of our soul's evolution.
No kidding.
Now, during eclipse seasons, and these happen twice every year, when the sun aligns with the moon's nodes. So the moon's nodes are the points where the moon conjoins with the path of the ecliptic. And when we have the sun join the moon's nodes in either a new or a full moon, that's when we experience the phenomenon of eclipses.
Right.
Now, everyone gets excited about astrology during eclipse seasons, I've noticed, because they tend to be significant periods of change.
Mhm.
People move, relationships shift, jobs shift, significant shifts tend to take place during eclipses, I've observed.
Mhm.
And that's because there's this time portal that opens up during eclipses, and it depends if it's a south or north nodal
Right.
eclipse, but it's
Mhm.
like there can be a time portal to the past or the future
Yeah, the
that
paint is
opens
wet.
up and everything starts to move around. So looking at eclipse seasons, which predictably happen every 6 months, are really useful, both in individual charts as well as what's going on in the collective. And coincidentally, we're speaking now just within 2 weeks of a solar eclipse in Taurus.
No
So
kidding.
things are just about to shift. I'll
Right.
quickly mention, since we're on
Mhm.
this subject, that the moon's nodes moved into Taurus Scorpio at the beginning of this year, I believe in January.
Mhm.
But the last set of eclipses were actually in the Gemini Sag polarity. So
Mhm.
these set of eclipses coming up in end of April, May 2022 are really going to bring in the nodal theme of Taurus Scorpio. We're going to notice the collective shift into this Taurus Scorpio polarity under these eclipses. And my guess is we're going to hear a lot about money and property.
And you're honest. You're honest.
And
in
the
Taurus.
entire economy is very unexpectedly
It could-
shifting.
Yeah, well, it's probably a welcome thing. It's definitely, the paint is wet in the world economy right now. And I suppose it's important for people to be developing on astrology, because there are vested interests in the world who know about astrology, who know about these eclipses, and are using them for their personal interests. However, those are going to go. I think it's important for everybody who's on the ground and trying to heal the world to also be a part of this evolutionary wet paint, so we can all share in painting the picture of the future.
Right on.
Yeah, beautiful. So, Timothy, now what I'd like to talk to you about is, when you and I were discussing, you gave me a nice little introductory idea of how the microcosm of a new moon is similar to the macrocosm of a solar eclipse. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what we would call the initiatory as well as the ending quality of a new moon. And eventually, let's relate that to how it relates to the solar eclipse.
That's a great question. And I hope this will be useful in helping, again, people to tie together some of the different techniques that are really reflecting similar symbols and archetypes. So, to break it down to its most basic archetypal symbolic level, what a new moon, well, I should say what a solar eclipse is a solar eclipse is a new moon.
Right.
So, of course, a solar eclipse and a new moon will have identical meaning and significance.
They literally happen at the same time.
Absolutely. Solar eclipse is a new moon that will come every 6 months.
Right.
And therefore, a new moon, we could generally say, is like a super new moon that's going to set a theme, an area of focus and intention, just how the new moon does for a forthcoming month lunar
Right.
cycle. Solar eclipse will set a cycle for that 6-month eclipse period, but
Right.
also because the moon's nodes has an 18-year roughly cycle. Every solar eclipse is also going to initiate a new 18-year cycle until the nodes come round
Right.
and they begin a new cycle again. Now, the symbol of a new moon we can further distill is a conjunction aspect. And so
Right.
what the significance of a conjunction is the ending and beginning of a new cycle. So it is at the point in time of a new moon that a cycle is completing and a new cycle is beginning.
Right.
That's what a conjunction symbolizes. Conjunction is actually the most powerful planetary aspect,
Yeah.
because it is a raw creative potential between the planets that are forming their new cycle together in this conjunction. So there's a raw creative potential to birth a whole new cycle during any conjunction. But this is certainly reflected in a new moon or a solar eclipse. Now, eclipses itself is a conjunction between a new or full moon and the moon's nodes.
Right.
So we can break apart these cycles and say an eclipse cycle is a new moon with a new conjunction to either the north or the south node. Because you could look at the north or the south node essentially as its own point. So you could have an eclipse opposite to the south node as much as it's on a conjunction to the north node, for example.
Right.
And that's how you actually read these aspects together, is that if it's a solar eclipse on the north node, that's a new cycle between the sun and moon and the north node. A
Being
south node
opposite the
solar
south.
eclipse would be beginning a new cycle with the south node. And as you mentioned, Rahu Ketu, they have all the difference in the world, because these are the dynamics between the past and the future. When we're dealing with a south nodal solar eclipse, it's a very different creature than a north nodal eclipse, because a south nodal eclipse is going to create a new cycle with the south node of the moon, which will bring up themes of the past. It's going to be an opportunity to review the past, which is not the same as going backwards either, by the way, because it's all evolution. But when a dimension to the past opens up, which, by the way, happens whenever we have astrology going on with the south node of the moon, those things take us back. It's the past being brought into the present in order to see the past, understand the past, and then evolve the past into the future. So when south nodal stuff goes on, it may feel like we're moving backwards, but it's actually past material being swept up to work with and evolve towards the intentions of the future.
To clarify.
Whereas a north node, it's like if we have a lot of action going on the north node of the moon, there's going to be new experiences coming into the collective.
Interesting.
That's part of the gift of this forthcoming Taurus eclipse, as it is a north nodal eclipse. And the fact that Uranus is there, it really is a collective signature. Hey, time to do something new. Time to open up a new way of doing Taurus.
Right. Even Uranus is connected to initiating newness of the energy that's coming there. So it seems to me that there seems to be a dance. And I will say, for everyone watching, you have been studying this much more in depth than I have. So I have to give that caveat, because this is part of where the nature of my questions are coming from. My Sagittarius moon is very okay with throwing pins and missing. It's just the nature of how I explore. I would like to ask, it seems to me that in the same way that every month we have a new moon, and then halfway through the month, there's a full moon. And this full moon, as you've mentioned, it kind of illuminates and shows the manifestation, because now there's light. Now we can see that there's a manifestation of what was initiated in the new moon. And this happens within the cycle of a month. I wonder if there's a similar conversation happening when we see a solar eclipse involving the north node, Rahu, and the conjunction of the sun and moon. This is the beginning initial point of a solar eclipse. Is there a similar thing happening? Could we almost call a new moon happening close to the south node as a sort of macrocosmic full moon for what was initiated during the solar eclipse?
No, we would not want to confuse the conjunction with the south node and compare that to a full moon. And it's a perfect segue because I did not mention that if the new moon archetypally reflects a conjunction, what the full moon archetypally reflects is an opposition aspect.
Got it.
And so every new moon is, again, the conjunction between the moon and the sun. And to even tie it together, we began this talk talking about the archetypal importance of the moon and the sun. It's like that is where our ego and the soul, the creative force are communing to experience life and to evolve through the sense of meaning and purpose and why we're feeling and living what we do. That's, again, what the lunar cycles really reflect back, is that personally lived experience. So the new moon is always the seed sowing time. We're dreaming in this intention. And by the way, we can even look at the fact that the several days before a new moon, the moon is called in what's a balsamic phase.
Right.
And this reflects a very Piscean nature. Gotcha. Similarly, you can look in the birth chart, and if you see a balsamic phase conjunction between any two planets, they will have this similar Piscean nature of reflecting on the entire last cycle. Right. In the case of the sun and moon, it would be reflecting on the last month. What were the goals from the prior new moon? How did that end up playing out? What are the loose ends that still need to be tied? What did we accomplish? What did we fail to accomplish? And it's this existential processing, contemplative Pisces time that's also incubating and dreaming the next lunar cycle.
Gotcha.
That at the new moon is born. And then in the days prior to the moon is in a new phase, which has a very Aries-like energy that is birthing and initiating this new cycle that typically at the new moon is still highly unconscious. You know, as magicians and witches and whatnot are very tuned into lunar cycles, it's like we use the new moon to sow an intention, but it's largely unconscious. You know, it gets discovered and unfolds throughout the entire forthcoming lunar cycle. Indeed. And the full moon, symbolized in the opposition, is when this cycle that began at the conjunction is now at a point where it can see itself.
It's illuminated.
The opposition has a nature of objectivity. Yes. And the cool thing too is just how I mentioned the conjunction can have either this Pisces Aries energy. Well, the full moon reflects the archetype of Libra.
For sure. It's the seeing the two, because Libra is the cohesive sign, whereas Aries is the initiating sign.
Yes. And this is the symbolism of the full moon as well, as the full moon can even bring the experience of others reflecting back to us, or the world reflecting back to us, that intention of the new moon. How well is that going? How is that unfolding? When you're looking at a full moon via an opposition, it's always a polarity. Right. So this is actually revealing a truth of nature, which is everything in life is actually reflecting this fundamental pattern that is an expansion and a contraction. This is the conjunction and the opposition. When we're at a full moon, that's when the moon is most distant from the sun. That's the objectivity, that's the distance. And through that separation, which is also the nature of relationships, right? Libra is not Pisces, where we're the same.
Right.
Libra is, there's two individuals in the tango together.
Cool.
So in the opposition, there's greater distance, there's greater objectivity, but just how the moon reflects back the sun's light, there is an ability to see via that objective feedback, what other people are saying, or it's the time in a full moon where what we sowed during the new moon starts to bear fruits. And again, we can see that. So the full moon can actually be challenging in the seeing.
Right.
So it brings this
Interesting.
clarity that also reveals itself. And this is, again, a fact of nature and life, is we learn, we know what life is through the experience of polarity.
Right, for
That's
sure.
how we have sensation, is we know the difference between hot and cold. This is the
Right.
two inner planets, Mercury, Venus, have this polarity nature, as you
Mhm.
know, I'm sure.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, again, this opposition Libra, seeing through polarity, seeing through reflection, is where we get a challenge of polarity, but it also reveals what we're working with, how it's going, and we get that type of objective feedback. So I'm pretty sure
Interesting.
it's an actual scientific fact that hospitals and jails are a little bit more full of people under full moons
Yeah,
because they
yeah,
are
yep.
collectively more tense times.
That's
It's like where we see that tension of what we're working at through the lens and the vehicle of polarity.
got it. I've often heard the intention of, people say that you're sowing seeds during the new moon and they kind of unfold in the full moon. I've often been confused by this in a way, but I think you've clarified it in the sense that the new moon has a blocked, not blocked, but like your vision is kind of eclipsed. And would you say it's a good idea to have the intention during a new moon to be receptive to what the divine intelligence of our intuition can give us about this present moment? And then once the full moon is happening, because we have an illumination as to the dynamics that's happening, it's a better time to be a bit more willful about what you want to apply in terms of your life, whereas the new moon is about reception to what's happening.
So this actually reflects phasal relationship. And what's really cool is that the 8 lunar phases, you can apply the same meaning and significance between any 2 planets. And this is a very core method that we use in evolutionary astrology. This was a method that was very pioneered by Dane Rudhyar, these different phases, and therefore the difference between a balsamic phase conjunction, a new phase conjunction, a gibbous phase opposition, a full phase opposition. There's not just a square aspect. There's actually 4 different types of squares. You've got the crescent phase first quarter square, the first quarter square, the disseminating third quarter square, the third quarter phase third quarter square. So these phases actually reflect the zodiac, the entire progression of life. Again, this is the fundamental pattern, is this contraction and this expansion, is the zodiac, and also the planetary aspects and any cycle, the 12 houses. It all reflects the same fundamental pattern here. So where was I
Very
going with this?
interesting.
I just lost my train of thought.
Talking about the new moon being a phase of
Oh yes,
reception.
that's right.
Yep.
So at the new moon, what I would recommend is, especially in the days prior to any new moon, that's when it's the time to honor the natural Piscean balsamic phase. It's the time to take that time of the month off. I use it this way. I'll go to a float tank, I'll go off into nature, and I'll reflect on the last month and the next month. In the new phase, this is when that new cycle is being broken in. It is still unconscious, but it's discovering itself by acting on instinct.
Cool. That's
and
clarifying.
That's the archetype of Aries. That's what Aries does, right? Aries acts first and then reflects on it after,
That's
so that's
totally
how we
clarifying.
use the new moon, is actually after the new moon. I find that there's a boost of energy.
Yeah.
And that's something that you can use.
Thank you,
now,
Timothy. That's very clarifying.
Right. This is stuff anyone can, test out and see, this month, because it's very felt, it's very evident. And I find also the gibbous phase just before a full moon, this reflects Virgo archetype. And gibbous phase can be a bit challenging and uncomfortable because something is about to become objectively seen, manifest, and understood. But in the gibbous phase, there tends to be improvements or rectification or things that need adjustment, or we get critical feedback from other people.
The Virgo.
And you can even see this in a birth chart. Say someone has Mercury in gibbous phase opposition to Jupiter in their chart. This person may, when they're spontaneously, intuitively speaking their truth, receive critical feedback from other people. And that is a necessary evolutionary experience, so that way they can refine their understanding, their spoken word, their ideas into something that in an opposition wants to become communicated, wants to get put out there.
Wow.
Similarly, the full phase after the full moon is a very Libra. That's the time to get out there. It's the time to put it out there. It's the time to collaborate, connect with people, and really test that polarity of the full moon, see how it's working. But what I would say is, in the actual 8-phasal cycle, the opposition is the beginning of the second hemicycle, where the first hemicycle is when a cycle is more so building itself individually, internally. It's getting prepared, and in the zodiac, this reflects Aries to Virgo, which are the individual signs, biological, what's going on in me. And then Virgo is the last sign of the personal hemicycle, where we're actually refining our own individual nature to prepare for the second hemicycle, which is going to be very much about social contribution, going back to the world, relationships, beginning with the sign of Libra. So after the full phase, there's a disseminating phase, and that is especially when we're getting fruits and putting things out there in the world. So certainly the cycle is not completed at the full moon. That's when the outward step of the rhythm is being initiated. And then at the new moon, we come back in.
Got it. I one question I'd like to say, because God, Timothy, you are just a living encyclopedia. I'd like to ask, do you think that regardless of the signs that are happening with these new moons and the full moon, would you say that when, for example, when the moon is in its gibbous phase, which correlates with a Virgoan energy, do you find yourself as a professional astrologer including in your prognosis of how a person ought to be approaching the days or whatever going forward? Let's say, for example, if a person has let's say they've got Mercury in Pisces and it's conjunct Saturn. And so this is a signature of someone who has difficulty with the Mercury phase of things in general. Mercury being in Pisces would be debilitated. And by being with Saturn, there's significations that the person perhaps has had traumatic experiences related to all things Mercury. During gibbous phases of the lunar cycle, would such a person be well served to know that that's a difficulty of theirs and to pay special attention to gibbous moon phases so that they can help integrate this in their personal life?
I hear what you're saying. I'm not certain if we would go so far as to say, the gibbous phase of every lunar cycle is going to bring up, this Mercury dynamics. I would be more concerned with, planetary aspects to that Mercury specifically. So I wouldn't draw the correlation between the lunar cycle and Mercury, although we're talking about the gibbous phase. I would keep planetary rulerships and planetary aspects as separate and distinct
Very good
techniques. And this is also where astrology gets really interesting, because this is where different branches have different perspectives and systems that they use. But to generalize your question, is it helpful to learn about the challenging parts of our chart and even the likely times when those things will come up? Because as an example, it's funny you actually mentioned a Mercury-Saturn conjunction. Because I was studying the chart of somebody who said, when the moon is at this exact degree, every cycle I have a mental breakdown. It's just like, wow, well, we got to look at what's going on in your chart with that. And lo and behold, that point in this person's chart is when the moon went opposite to her exact degree Mercury-Saturn conjunction.
Wow, interesting.
So in that case, we would certainly say, well, every month there's going to be that opposition. You can anticipate these themes. And not only
so that does happen.
As good astrologers, what we want to do is illuminate people's difficult parts of their chart, but also make people feel good
Yeah,
about those challenges
for sure,
and
of
feel
course.
prepared, strong, and resourcewell in them, and not just give somebody a challenge and then leave them empty-handed.
Yeah, this is going to be hard, so good luck. Yeah,
Right.
I'm with you on that. Yeah, for sure. That's just the nature of astrology, is that, you know, everybody has these bumps and divots in their energy field, but it's only a mistake if you can't rectify it. It's only a difficulty if you can't apply intelligence to it. And every
Right. Just
aspect.
as a friendly suggestion to all my fellow astrologers, if you can point out a problem but don't have a really helpful resolution, just don't even point it out.
Well
Unless a
said.
person's specifically asking for it, like, hey, I'm
Mhm.
struggling in relationship, you know, then we could talk about that. But
Right.
if no one brought up relationship and you're doing a reading and you start to talk about somebody's relationship problems, I don't know how
Suddenly they're
useful that would
thinking,
be.
yeah, they're thinking about things that might not even be there. You know,
Yeah.
I'm totally with you on that, Timothy.
Mhm.
So this is great stuff, and I love where we're going with this. Now, what I've been interested to ask you, Timothy, for this particular session that we're having here, I would like to think about this idea that the solar eclipses have, what I have seen, and I've been kind of observing this a little bit, and I'd love to give you any information that you can. I'd like to start moving towards what you and I talked about before we went into start recording. I mentioned that I noticed that solar eclipses tend to generally be, I almost feel, and let's see if I can make the proper correlation here, because you mentioned that there's an 18-year cycle regarding the movement of solar eclipses through the zodiac. So what I'm thinking of is, and we're going to show examples of my own personal natal chart, and we're going to talk about how, interestingly, whenever a solar eclipse happens, we can see an evolutionary progression of sorts happening, and it goes backwards, just like the north node and the south node also go backwards. So here's what I mean. In August 21st of 2017, there was a solar eclipse in the sign of Leo, and it was at the latter degrees of Leo. Now, I'm a Leo rising, so this would have happened in my first house. We can talk about all the things that are interesting there. First, I want to kind of see if I can give this big picture perspective. 2017, August, solar eclipse in Leo. Now, 2 years later, July, around the first week of July of 2019, there was a solar eclipse in the sign of Cancer, and that would be my 12th house. Now, another year ahead, in June 20th, around June 20th, 2020, there was a solar eclipse in the sign of Gemini, kind of on the Gemini Cancer cusp, and that would have been in my 11th house. So these solar eclipses are happening and climbing up to my 10th house, which is going to happen in Taurus this year. Very excited. Now, this progression is happening. I see that ultimately, as you and I did a little bit of scoping out, we discovered that in 2027, February, around the first week of February in 2027, there's going to be a solar eclipse in the sign of Aquarius. And the North Node is going to be in Aquarius. And that's where the solar eclipse is going to happen. So this is a 10-year progression where 2017, the solar eclipse happened in Leo, my first house. 2027, the solar eclipse is happening in Aquarius, in my 7th house. Now, we've already made correlations for the solar eclipse relating to a new moon and this initiating energy. What I'm trying to digest is the evolutionary narrative that would be happening for a person. Let's say this one first. Is it is there some semblance of truth to this idea that I'm kind of intuiting here, where something was started in the solar eclipse of Leo in my first house? Could we almost correlate that in 2027, when the solar eclipse happens in Aquarius, that there is almost a sort of, I'm almost inclined to say a full moon in this larger evolutionary narrative? Although, of course, the solar eclipse is more of a new moon phenomenon. So what can we say in terms of the phase of completion represented by the solar eclipses having gone through the top of my chart, now coming to the 7th house of Aquarius in my chart? Would you say that there is a completion or an initiation of completion of the hemispherical completion happening when the solar eclipse happens in Aquarius in 2027? Have I made myself clear there, Timothy?
Yeah, I do understand your question. And it's going to go back to, again, this experience and observation of polarity.
Mm-hmm.
And so to break it down, when we're talking about a solar eclipse, say in your first house on your ascendant, that will be a conjunction between that solar eclipse and ascendant, which means if roughly 9-10 years later, you have a solar eclipse that's opposite to that ascendant.
Right.
That's the archetypal significance, is that solar eclipse will have the symbolism of an opposition to the ascendant. Now, could we say that's the same as a conjunction to the descendant? Yes, it is.
Right.
But because we're looking at these points as complete cycles, when that next cycle would, we could say, begin again, would be the 18 years for the moon's nodes to complete their full cycle. Because that's the actual cycle that we're talking about, is the moon's nodes.
Right.
And I'm really excited to have this conversation with you, because I would really love for more practicing and folks interested in astrology to pay attention to the transits of the moon's nodes through the houses of your chart.
Certainly.
Because that's going to explain so many of the experiences that you're having at that particular point in time. For example, you mentioned that first eclipse in 2017 being in your first house. And something that's quite common when the North Node is transiting the first house, and then certainly whenever we have that solar eclipse on the North Node in the first house, that's bang, going to be the beginning of a new cycle. There's going to be an experience. There's going to be a shift that's introducing the intentions of that cycle beginning in the first house, which will have an intention of individualization.
Right.
Individual empowerment, freedom. And something that's quite common that I have observed, many of my clients have had to go through rites of passage or experiences where they are separating to honor that Aries first house individualization direction.
Right.
Now,
you know what I'd love to, if you don't mind me saying this, Timothy, well, one of the, and I don't want to break your thought here, but just to quickly reiterate, one of the reasons why I'm sort of bringing this up and thinking about it is because I think most people observe, the reason I wanted to talk with you about this is because, like many people, I observe for sure the transiting of the nodes through the signs. But what I'm starting to realize is that oftentimes, because I don't have the understanding of the eclipses, I'm beginning to now, and now I'm going to observe these, but in my own experience, I always watch the transiting of the nodes going through the signs, but it often seems like I can't really see it in terms of things that actually happen in my life. For example, in 2017, it was a very important year, and I might have correlated it with many different things. But by talking with you, I realized that a huge, important initiatory point happened in my journey when it was actually in August of 2017. That is when the eclipse happened. Now, the North Node began in Leo and moved through that whole area of Leo, of my first house, for that whole year. But it was the biggest, heaviest moment was during the eclipse. And if I hadn't made this correlation to the eclipses, the North Node transits might just feel like a Jupiter transit. Something's going to happen. Something special is going to happen to that house at some point during the year. I don't know exactly what, but the eclipses seem to be the calendrically precise moment where I began my journey as signified by the evolutionary narrative of my North Node, the North Node transiting my first house. It was in August of 2017 that the eclipse happened, that I launched out to Peru. I did ayahuasca. I was in a self-deprecating place. I felt completely victimized. I went to Peru and did ayahuasca and literally barfed up all of that victimization consciousness. So this is the reason why I'm bringing in.
And that eclipse, I remember, was also on your Chiron, isn't that right?
That's correct,
Which I
my
find
friend.
very appropriate, because if any planet describes the barfing experience, that would be Chiron.
No kidding, the shamanic thing there. Now, I think that we have the intention to show my chart and to show this, but to reiterate, I'd love for you to, I'd love for you to give your idea of the full prognosis of this 2017 moment to the 2027 moment of Aquarius happening here in the way that you were speaking to it. Okay.
Sure. So I'm going to try to break it down and be as concise as I can, because I understand this is a little bit technical. So just to kind of simplify it, we'll use the example of a solar eclipse in the first house on the ascendant. And then you're asking about, well, what about 9 to 10 years later when there's another solar eclipse, we'll say in the 7th house on the descendant. And I'm going to use that to just simplify the example of how we're talking about polarity.
Perfect.
Okay. So what an eclipse is going to do is it's, again, a conjunction that's initiating this cycle. So it's like the moon's nodes are going, clockwise backwards through the zodiac. And then every time there's a solar eclipse, it's going to initiate that direction. So it's like, okay, moon's nodes are going through the 12th house, boom, solar eclipse. Now that 12th house theme's being brought in.
Right.
North
At a
node
felt
going to
level.
the 11th house. As soon as that solar eclipse comes in, that's when that 11th house new cycle is going to begin. So the moon's nodes are moving like this, but the boom, boom, boom. And this is how new moons work too.
Right.
It's like, it's a key frame when we're looking at, an animation. I was an animator before I did astrology.
Cool.
There's important key frames where if you're doing an animation, you'll draw 2 important positions before you fill in all the drawings in between, and that's like what a new moon is. It's these key frames that if we were to go through time really quickly, it's going to show us these key movements, but time's always going on. So in between those key frames, the cycles are unfolding. But
that's a
at
psychedelic
those key
image.
frames, there is this, it's a psychedelic life.
Yeah. Ain't it the truth? Yeah.
It's wild. So yeah, that's when there's going to be these major themes that are being brought in up until the next solar eclipse. So to use this first 7th house example, at the time of this first house solar eclipse, there's going to be themes, experiences, challenges that are bringing up that north nodal first house intention, which is, again, the individualization, being able to be strong on our own. Aries themes, being confident to go to the beat of our own drum instinctively without having to check in on other people. That's what the soul wants to learn when the north node's going through the first house. Now, 9 years later, when the north node starts to transit the 7th house, the south node is going to be transiting the first at the same time. The soul's learning 7th house direction, how to share, how to collaborate, how to listen, so that way we can co-create with other souls. Now, is there going to be a distinct reflection and connection to the solar eclipse 9 years prior? Yes, because it brings up the ascendant-descendant polarity, which may be, as an example, say, now we're, at the seventh house solar eclipse, we might say, oh, wow, 9 years ago, I really initiated this journey of individualization. I went off to this retreat, I'm completely off on my own. And now I'm reflecting back on some of the intentions and directions that formed during that time 9 years ago, and it's shifting. I'm needing to bring that out into a more collaborative, creative type of way. I'm not just running off anymore. I'm needing to actually sit and listen. So there can absolutely be a connection, not only archetypally, symbolically, but in the actual experience of time and how everything's unfolding.
Right.
But there can be, via the looking at the chart, the recognition of that symbolic connection. It's like, hey, during this phase, I was stepping into first house. And now 9 years later, I'm stepping into seventh house. And that's what we see.
I totally see that.
Teeter-tottering and staying balanced. And that's especially reflected in the themes of the moon's nodes. It's like, if someone has their north node transiting the first house and they're just talking so much about their struggles and partnerships and codependency, it's like, well, yeah, now is the time to be working on autonomy.
And it's, of course, what I'm cluing into in my head, because I see why you keep mentioning the fact that, just as the north node through these solar eclipses is moving, and this is this initiating energy, of course, the south node is doing the opposite, is coming along, so that by the time the solar eclipse happens in Aquarius, the new energy is leading towards my seventh house. That must mean, of course, that the south node of the past life, of having been too much, it will reflect that if the south node is in Leo, that means that I have been steeped in this initiatory phase for too much, or shall we say the first house consciousness. Now I'm yearning to integrate it through Aquarius and through this my seventh house in this sense, right? Because the south node is in my first house.
And that's again where this gets technical. But if we were to say you have a solar eclipse on the descendant, that solar eclipse would be opposite to the ascendant, which means that solar eclipse would have the archetype of the opposition. The experiences happening on the descendant through the mirror of relationship would be illuminating the instinctual dynamics of the ascendant. And that could, again, even look back at time, like, hey, 9 years ago when I was doing this instinctual exploration, now that I'm getting all this mirroring back through relationship, I'm through that opposition illumination. Now I'm seeing and understanding why I had to do that 9 years ago.
Wow.
The south node of the moon's going to conjunct that ascendant at the same time. Wherever the south node is transiting, that's where the past is coming up to learn and grow through past coming up. So the south node on the ascendant is going to bring up ascendant themes, instincts, individualization, but it's like, how have I done this in the past? Is the evolutionary need that's there. And then just as, one more example, if there was a lunar eclipse while the sun was in the seventh house, so if there's a south node lunar eclipse on the ascendant, that would be an extremely emotionally instinctual lunar eclipse that would be bringing up the themes of the past to clearly look at that instinctual way of behaving.
Wow. So it's really, there's these spirals, these concentric circles of spiraling evolutionary arcs, where there's the larger sphere, and within each larger, the 10-year span from the solar eclipse in the first house to the solar eclipse in the seventh house is a 10-year span. And within, it's like a larger circle, but there are circles happening within the larger circle. It's an incredible understanding. Now, I'd like to ask you, Timothy, would you say that you could, in certain ways, apply the hemispherical and phase consciousness that you've mentioned, where, for example, it'll be many years down the line, probably another, let's say 7 or 8 years after that 10-year point. So let's say probably about 2034, the solar eclipse is probably going to happen probably somewhere around Cancer, Virgo. No, what am I trying to say? Gemini. I'm sorry, I'm flipping it in my brain. What I'm trying to say is that the solar eclipse around 2034 will probably be happening around Libra, Virgo, and then eventually Leo again. So would there be, in this same way, a balsamic reception to what was initiated at 2017? You know, about like, let's say 15 years later, there's going to be a gibbous, I'm sorry, not gibbous, but a balsamic phase where I will be coming into a reception of another new solar eclipse in my first house, which will eventually fully manifest.
Yes, because you could say balsamic phase to a house cusp, you could say balsamic phase to a planet, your own moon's nodes, the last eclipse, the last new moon, any
these
one of
time
those
waves, any one of these time waves, as you've mentioned, can have phases in this way. Very good, yeah. Timothy. Now, Timothy, this has just been very elucidating, I think. Now, you and I had the idea we've just really brought this into, because what I wanted to do is show people like the big picture of what we're talking about here. This 18-year evolutionary arc of the larger concentric circle represented by the solar eclipses moving through the houses of the personal zodiac. Now, I would love, and you know, this is depending on your time, how much we want to roll with here. This has already been a long video, but I'm okay with it because this is feeling like a juicy conversation that we're having. I'm thinking of moving towards, for everyone's sake, showing my personal chart, showing my chart and the transit of the solar eclipse that happened in 2017. We can talk a little bit about it. Then we can show how the next solar eclipse was in Cancer in my 12th house. Then the next one was in Gemini in my 11th house. And we could talk a little bit about how you as an evolutionary astrologer would apply your approach to helping a client integrate that narrative. I'm thinking of moving in that direction. I just wanted to ask you if you wanted to add anything to what we've been talking about.
I think that would be awesome.
Cool.
And thank you for volunteering your chart because, yeah, I'd love to demonstrate my approach. And I think it's the best way to really learn astrology, to see it through a lived experience. So
to see it fleshed out. Okay, my friend. So what I'm going to do